Chapter 42. A Jailbird's Song. You know, I was almost thinking they weren't going to get you. Knox continued in his bitter tone from across the way. I didn't think Ponyville's guards had the resources to capture an alicorn. Good for them, really.
You...
That was all Twilight could manage to say as she glared at the Sorosian through the bars. There was a volatile cocktail of potent emotions at the unexpected sight of him. Now it was obvious why Rainbow had stuck Twilight in the cell. She was baiting the alicorn into fishing out any information she could from Knox. Either her own interrogations hadn't gone very well, or she no longer had the time to conduct them thanks to the problems Twilight had caused. Whatever the reason, Twilight was clearly supposed to talk with him in some form or fashion, even though she really didn't want to right now, especially with Spike being in the vicinity, with nowhere for him to go. What was she even supposed to ask? Sure, she had questions, but what could she do to inspire him to tell her in the first place? The only thing Twilight had was superior power granted to her as an alicorn, but threats of violence were not on the table for her. She had already gotten herself into enough trouble, and she didn't need assault charges for attacking the elderly piled on top.
Twilight?
Spike whispered up at her, instantly snuffing out the flames of her rage.
Who's that guy? That's... Knox Onwud, Spike.
She answered calmly enough, her eyes moving back and forth between her son and her foe.
I think I've told you about him once or twice. He's my boss at the library.
For whatever it's worth at this juncture, you're fired. Knox's interruption rekindled Twilight's aggression, something he seemed to revel in beneath his bitter expression. You were a great librarian, but getting me arrested was a step too far.
That's really him? That's the bad guy?
Much to Twilight's dismay, Spike stepped closer to the wall of bars to get a closer look at him. While Twilight had kept him in the dark about many things, Spike at least knew about Knox and his involvement in Twilight's recent affairs. He sat there for a short while, his eyes narrowed with curiosity before he spoke.
I thought he'd be intimidating.
Knox huffed loudly in response, his bitterness giving way to a short-lived chuckle. And I was expecting the first dragon I met to be impressive. That jab at Spike was where Twilight drew the line. Her horn flashed to life, gently but quickly whisking Spike away from the barred door and towards the back of the cell, eliciting a small yelp of surprise with him in the form of protest. She put herself between Spike and Onwud, blocking his malicious gaze from reaching her baby, and glared back.
Do not talk to him.
Her words were powerful and commanding, as was to be expected of an alicorn. She splayed her wings out slowly and majestically to play up her true nature, as well as further obscure Spike from Knox's glare. Hopefully, the display would silence Knox before he could say anything truly detrimental. If knowledge of the choir really was as dangerous as Rainbow said, then the last thing Twilight needed was for Onwud to endanger Spike with just a few simple words. Surprisingly enough, Knox seemed to heed Twilight's words. He fell silent at the threat, though his outward demeanor remained unchanged. He sat there in the middle of his cell, glaring bitterly into the adjacent room, his eyes sinister. From there, Twilight's time in the holding cell was long and exhausting. Every moment was spent under Knox's gaze, and every sound they made, he no doubt heard. Privacy was a luxury they no longer had, made clear from the very first few moments within the holding cell. Knox didn't say a word as Twilight tried her best to ignore him, just stayed there and glared with that bitter expression. He didn't seem surprised by Twilight's wings, nor the dragon accompanying her, meaning he either didn't care, or he already knew. Twilight sincerely hoped it was the former, as the latter worried her deeply if it was true. She did all she could for now, ignoring the stallion as best she could, and tending to Spike in the back of the cell, far away from Knox as they could go, and speaking as quietly as possible. She kept herself between the dragon and the bat, for both of their sakes. She didn't want to deal with Knox right now, nor did she want Spike to have to. Not right now, at the very least. The mess she had gotten herself into was important, but she considered Spike's well-being and safety to be her top priority, above all else. She worked to diverge their topic away from that and towards something more relevant to Spike. Despite being presented with a possible outlet for answers regarding the conspiracy she had gotten herself into, Twilight's top priority was Spike. Maybe dragging him with her into this prison cell wasn't the best idea, but right now, her side was the safest place in the world for him. And she wanted him to feel safe. So she began asking him about the one positive thing that had happened to him today. Spike didn't have much to say on the subject of the 3 fillies who had reached out to him. Just a short little summary of how they had found him crying in their clubhouse after school, and how they had agreed to help him out. Based on the story, though, those kids left an immensely positive impression on him. He couldn't stop grinning as he went on. When the 2 of them were accidentally whisked to this place in their hasty escape from that dragon so long ago, the absolute last thing Twilight had expected was Spike finding friendship in this little country town. It made her proud and happy for him. Though Spike's heartwarming tale wasn't enough to keep Twilight from glancing over her shoulder at Knox, who just kept staring. It was unnerving, almost intimidating, given the ferocity of his glare. Twilight knew that he knew many things that no one should. It made her skin crawl, and it made him dangerous, more than any elderly stallion had any right to be. While he presented no immediate threat, she couldn't help but feel like he had something planned. The status quo only changed when they were granted dinner for the evening, something that Twilight hadn't even really thought about. There hadn't been a single scrap of food she had eaten since breakfast, and that was most likely true for Spike. The food wasn't great. Buttered wheat toast, a few pieces of fruit, some mashed potatoes and gravy. It wasn't special, and it certainly wasn't gourmet, but it wasn't bad. Just bland. It served its purpose in the end, and that's all anyone could ask of food. Spike didn't seem to mind how lackluster the rations were, wolfing them down with vigor, and a testament to how hungry he was. Knox, in contrast, took his time savoring his meal, providing Twilight with the first respite from his unyielding gaze for the first time since this started. But once dinner was said and done, the routine resumed right where it had begun. Hours began to pass, and Twilight did all she could to keep herself and Spike distracted from Knox's relentless gaze. Soon enough, the light of the setting sun dwindled and was replaced by the ominous light of the moon. At some point, Twilight didn't even need to convince Spike to crawl into the cell's sorry excuse for a bed and get some sleep. The wall-mounted board held up a barely comfortable mattress and a cheap white blanket, but it was plenty to let Spike drift off into dreams, prompting a sigh of relief from Twilight. The bed was barely big enough for one pony, let alone a pony and a long dragon, so Twilight would be sleeping on the floor tonight. That wasn't probably the best idea for her health, but it was a worthy sacrifice for his. With Spike taken care of, Twilight was free to focus on the Sorosian. In the darkness of the night, the elderly stallion was now nothing but an ominous silhouette in his cell. But his nocturnal eyes caught what little light there was in just the right way to set them ablaze with a sinister yellow glow, allowing Twilight to clearly see his glare even from here. He didn't move. He didn't blink. And Twilight was honestly unsure if he was even breathing. One could be forgiven for mistaking him as a hyper-realistic statue of her former employer. But she knew for a fact that he was a flesh and blood. And judging by his glare, he wanted to make Twilight bleed. She had had enough.
Are you going to say something? Or are you going to spend all night mean-mugging me?
Oh, may I speak now? Knox almost smirked, but his resentment was enough to overpower the impulse. He growled before continuing, ignoring Twilight's question. Well, you just couldn't help getting in our way, could you? Twilight furrowed her brow at him. She honestly didn't know what she'd been expecting. Of course he knew about her accidental involvement and everything, though. It only stood to reason that the choir would warn him of her meddling. Or maybe he was just projecting onto her out of spite for almost reading that book of his. Or it could be any number of other reasons that Twilight couldn't come up with. There was no way of telling for sure without asking him. And given that that was what Rainbow Dash wanted her to do, she didn't see any reason to hold back, now that Spike was taken care of.
That depends on the hour you're talking about.
Don't play dumb with me, child. I know of your transgressions upon their sacred realm. The Sorosian hissed back at her in Siaran. Accident or not, such a heretical act must not go unpunished. I hope you realize this. A moment passed as Twilight parsed the threat. Her Siaran was a bit rusty, and it wasn't helped by how quickly Knox was speaking. But before long, she remembered the basics and delivered a reply.
I'm going to guess that they've been speaking to you?
Why would they not? I've long since proven myself as one of their most faithful clerics. If a threat to their glorious encore arrives, it is my duty, nay, my privilege, to snuff it out.
Definitely a cult.
Twilight confirmed silently upon mentally translating his rebuttal. The choir itself wasn't a cult, as she had initially guessed, but they weren't without their worshippers. She chose to take this as a moral victory before turning her thoughts back to the more relevant topic.
Well, you're welcome to try. I don't think you're gonna get very far on that front, however.
She lazily stretched out a wing to remind Knox of what she really was. Do not think yourself above me just because you are an alicorn, child. Knox stood from his seated position and slowly walked up towards the door and into the light. He framed his now moonlit face between two of the metal bars, continuing to glare at her like a beast wanting to pounce upon his prey. After your little dream-walking stunts, you should know very well that your kind are not as eternal as your queen would have the world believe. One of Twilight's hooves found its way up to her throat with that, and she recalled the visage of Celestia I being assassinated. A memory that did not belong in her head, and one of the few that she could still recall even after waking from the dream. A turning point in equestrian history that she had known about since the earliest history classes in her education, now given a gruesome new context in her head. The shudder that ran down her spine only heightened by Knox's comment about her dreamwalking escapades, an unnecessary confirmation that he knew more than Twilight would have liked. The revelation entirely overshadowed the fact that Knox had basically just threatened to kill her if she continued. as the elderly Sarosian was not in any way physically a threat to Twilight. And even then, a mere alicorn couldn't hope to stand against the choir's might. Knox almost chuckled as he continued with his monologue. Honestly, I can't even fathom why you'd even bother. There's no point in trying. Of all the things that Knox had said so far, that was what got under Twilight's skin. To her surprise, it was insulting that all of her hard work could be dismissed as pointless so flippantly. The exact reason why that, of all things, riled her up was beyond her, but Knox's insult had once again stoked her anger.
Because you're clearly up to no good, and I've seen more than enough to prove that.
She didn't bother answering in Ciaran as she stood and spun around.
I don't know what exactly it is you're doing, but I know you've gone a very long way to keep it secret. And I've done everything in my power to stop it. It's over.
Twilight, my dear, if you think that my imprisonment here is anything more than a minor inconvenience, then you are very mistaken. As I'm sure you've deduced by now, I am but a humble pawn in a much larger game, a pawn that has already played his part spectacularly. The other disciples shall finish their preparations in my stead, just as preordained. Knox chuckled again as his head tilted up towards the ceiling, a smile of absolute joy coming across his face as he basked in the pale moonlight. Soon all of our hard work shall bear fruit, and nobody will be able to stop their glorious encore.
Encore?
Twilight had noticed when Knox used that word before, but she hadn't paid much mind to it at first. But if he was going to keep bringing it up, then she was going to ask about it. She had a few ideas, but she wasn't going to learn anything useful if she didn't keep him talking.
Mind telling me what that's all about?
If Knox had known Twilight was here to interrogate him, then it was at this moment that he had chosen to show either his ego or his naivety. His yellow eyes glistened in the moonlight as he adjusted his gaze, filled with sinister knowledge and giddy intent. It was the kind of look that someone gives when asked to explain their favorite book, or in Knox's case, his perverse religion, and he seemed to take great pride in being given the excuse to educate someone on the matter. His smile expanded more than Twilight thought was possible, unsettlingly so. It grows closer with each setting of the sun. The choir of moonlight shall return to our world, and their song shall finally be heard. Knox explained with absolute delight, his eyes wide, almost lifeless, as if the core of his being had been hollowed out and replaced with something else. Something wrong, eerie, and malicious, yet gracious and gentle. Onwud looked less like himself than Twilight had ever seen, more akin to a lifeless puppet, rather than the stallion Twilight had known for the better part of a month. It wasn't even the same stallion she'd seen brief glimpses of in his short bursts of wrath. No, whoever this was different. A vacant facsimile of the stallion Twilight had just been speaking with. At least that's what it felt like. To an outsider looking in, it almost looked like he was being driven by a will not his own, controlled from afar. It was disturbing, to say the least. I've already heard it myself, Twilight. I have heard the choir sing, and it is marvelous, and soon the whole world shall hear them sing. Knox continued, loud enough to be heard from Twilight's cell, standing and propping himself against the bars with his hooves. His breathing became slow and heavy as his excitement escalated, giving him an even more fanatical appearance. But even so, his voice remained reasonably level. He wasn't screaming, but he was clearly excited. It's too late for you to stop them now, Twilight. It's already been put into motion. We've won. My colleagues will finish what I started, and the world shall finally unite in true harmony. And all shall at last ascend beyond these mere mortal husks. Is that not what you desire most, Twilight Sparkle? Freedom from the mortality of those around you? Freedom from your impossible choice? Knox's haggard and frantic breathing became the only sound audible within the cells. The fanatic Sorosian staring at her feverishly, waiting for an answer to his question. His words hadn't been lost on her. In fact, she was taking them to heart. The idea that Knox, and by extension the choir, knew of her deepest anxieties shouldn't have surprised her. And really it didn't. But it was still upsetting. Mostly because the choir's supposed end goal was the alleged ascension of all life in this world. Something that did match a desire she didn't know she had until just now. Albeit in a very twisted way. She had thought about it before. Briefly. It was an idea that had crossed her mind once or twice some years ago, but it had never gone any farther than that. He'd never intended on actually going through with anything that could bring those fantasies to life. She couldn't bring herself to put her loved ones through what she had, to give them the curse of eternal life without their consent. It would only cause more problems than it solved. The only way for it to work without hurting anyone would be to make everyone immortal, but even that would have its consequences. She had figured that out a long time ago. Even so, Twilight found herself disgusted by the idea that Knox believed that her interests aligned with that of the choir. While it was true that watching the people around her fade away scared her, she had come to grips with it. Her outburst earlier had been a moment of weakness prompted by a string of very unfortunately timed coincidences. The long overdue release of emotions that had been bottled up for 7 years too many. She may not have liked it, but on some level at least, she had come to accept it. Besides, whatever this ascension was that the choir had planned, surely wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Twilight knew from near enough to first have experienced that the choir was malicious, ruthless, and deceitful. Whatever it had promised Knox and his allies was almost certainly a lie, or at the very least, twisted. And it was undoubtedly twisting their minds to make them act on their behalf. Knox's display just now would certainly serve as solid evidence of that. He looked to have lost his mind.
Well, then I guess I have more work to do, don't I?
Twilight scoffed back, trying to hide her uneasiness. She didn't know what else to say at this point, really. What could she say? For now, she just decided to brush it off, play it like she wasn't distressed, and hopefully convince him to spill something more substantial in the process. Knox took his time taking in her words. His breath relaxed as he lowered himself from the bars. His expression became neutral, as if he were lost or confused for a moment. Maybe he hadn't even been aware of it. Another thought that served to unsettle Twilight. She used this brief window to calm herself down as well, backing up from the mental edge that Knox had pushed her to. Nothing was going to get done if she lost herself in her own emotions again. She had learned that the hard way earlier today. It wasn't until she had calmed completely that he once again spoke. You're welcome to try. But there's not much else you can accomplish. Everything you've stumbled on thus far has been sheer dumb luck. My associates are poised to complete the preparation without me, and it's very clear that I was the only lead you and the authorities had. You won't find me the traitorous sort. I will tell you nothing. I will throw away nothing that we have worked for. He kept bringing up his associates, these fellow disciples who were still out and about, scheming and planning. It was like he was trying to taunt Twilight with that fact, like a child teasing another about a secret they wouldn't tell. Juvenile, and really stupid given his predicament. After a moment of consideration, Twilight found herself wondering why he was bragging like this to her of all people. After all, the day Twilight had gotten involved in all this, Knox had practically painted a bullseye on at least one of his comrades. Something Twilight decided to take a shot at.
You're putting a lot of faith in Starlight Glimmer, aren't you?
There wasn't a moment's hesitation before she stepped forward and framed her own face between the bars. It wasn't comfortable, but it gave her a better view of her opponent.
You weren't exactly subtle about her involvement.
The reaction Knox gave wasn't what Twilight had been expecting. He didn't try to deflect her claim at all, if that option even came to mind. Instead, he looked confused, as if the words that just came out of Twilight's mouth were utter nonsense. I'm sorry, that's not a name I'm familiar with. He shook his head slowly, looking from point to point in front of him as if searching for an answer to some question. If this was an act, it was very convincing. If she didn't know any better, Twilight would think he actually didn't know her. I have spent decades in this town. I've never once met anybody by that name, disciple or not.
Oh, don't give me that. You know exactly who I'm talking about. She's the one who tipped me off to this whole thing in the first place. I already know.
I'm not playing dumb, Twilight. I honestly have no idea who you're... He stopped dead in his tracks, and his confusion was swallowed up by a look of absolute terror. The kind of terror that comes with the sudden realization that something terrible just transpired. Oh no. No, no! That traitorous little whore! The terror was replaced with rage, Knox lunging at the bars like a feral animal, screaming and hissing as he flailed his legs outside in an attempt to break free. He pushed with tremendous force as he tried to squeeze his head out between the bars in his frenzy, his sudden outburst enough to make Twilight recoil in shock and wake Spike. His rage reminded Twilight of how she had acted earlier today, much to her shame. It was like watching a rabid animal trying to break out of its cage. You have to let me out! Right now! Knox screamed louder than someone should reasonably be able to, his voice screechy and cracking from the strain. If I don't stop her now, she'll ruin everything! I have to warn them! I have to warn them! Just like that, his outburst stopped, as suddenly as it had started. His forelegs returned to the cement floor, and he backed away from the bars, eyes wide and trembling. He didn't look angry anymore, just worried. And Twilight couldn't help but get the feeling that she had seen this reaction somewhere before. Tell Twilight that we need to talk. She'll know where to find me. Knox's next words came out slow and shaky, as if he was being forced to say them. He shut his eyes and shook his head as if trying to shake off some nasty headache, before looking back to Twilight with a puzzled look. I'm sorry. What were we talking about? It clicked into place, and Twilight realized where she had seen this before. She remembered her meet and greet with Applejack and Rarity, how Applejack had shown off the memory alteration magic that Knox had been using to hide his machinations. How Rarity had suddenly remembered everything before once again having her recollections confiscated by the hastily made charm. And while what she had just witnessed wasn't exactly the same, it was too similar to be ignored.
She wiped herself from his mind.
Twilight muttered under her breath, the gears in her head spinning at full speed with this new information. The biggest inconsistency between Rarity's example and what she had just witnessed here were the words they said. Rarity had mumbled some chant used to praise the choir, while Knox's was clearly a set of instructions for him. A set of instructions that, perplexingly enough, involved Twilight. She didn't need to be told when this happened, though. It was safe to assume it had happened at some point last night, when Starlight had conveniently whisked Knox away from the library.
And she used that spell to leave a message for me? Twilight, what's going on?
Spike finally spoke from the back, his voice confused and rattled from his rude awakening.
It's fine.
Twilight said quickly, walking over to the bed and looking Spike in the eyes.
Everything's fine. Just go back to sleep.
But what was it with all the shouting?
Was I shouting just now? Knox asked, a huff rubbing at the side of his head. Why does my head hurt? Twilight's attention turned back to him, and she took a moment to collect her thoughts on the subject. Whatever had happened to Knox, whatever he had said, it had to be important. It sounded important at the very least. And Twilight felt the need to make sure she got the message. Triggering the reaction again wouldn't be too hard.
We were talking about that friend of yours, Starlight Glimmer,
Twilight said, her words slow and cautious, making sure Knox heard the name again. Getting him to think about her at all seemed to be the trigger.
You know, Starlight Glimmer, one of your little disciples. She was at the library the other day. She had your book about the choir. Don't know why you checked it out to her publicly like that, but it did help me learn that her name was Starlight Glimmer when she showed me her library card. She was even with you last night, helping you out with whatever it is you're trying to do.
As before, there was a time where Knox denied knowing that enigmatic mare at all. But after a little bit of pressing, the reaction was triggered again. It was almost identical to last time, surprise transforming into anger that quickly led him to lash out in a desperate attempt to get free of his cell. The ferocity behind his outrage wasn't as startling the second time, but his tantrum went utterly ignored when Spike began to speak up.
Twilight, she was in the house!
Spike blurted out, barely audible with Knox's thrashing about. Twilight's attention was off the Sorosian and locked solely on her son.
I was gonna tell you. I was supposed to tell you, but she was there.
Wait, what? Spike, slow down and breathe.
Twilight pleaded, rushing over and cupping his face in a forehuff.
What do you mean she was in the house? When was she in the house?
He was hyperventilating at this point, a distorted way of completing Twilight's request for him to breathe.
It was the other night. I woke up. She was there. You were asleep. She was talking like she...
Spike's words started off to a slow stop, at about the same time that Knox's outburst on the other side of the hallway began to cease. A red flag if ever there was one.
Like she what? Like she what? Spike!
Twilight was more assertive than worried at this point. The knowledge that there had been an intruder in her home was disturbing enough, and was made worse by the fact that the intruder had intercepted Spike and done something to him to make him forget it. It was worrying, only made worse when the spell had been cast upon the Sorosian finally kicked in, and he and Spike spoke at the same time.
Tell Twilight that we need to talk. She'll know where to find me.
Starlight Glimmer, I was here to help, even if I didn't do a very good job.
Knox's forced words brought some kind of clarity to Twilight, while Spike's only brought fear and outrage. All of her thoughts were centered on Spike and his well-being. She didn't care about Knox or the choir or anything else. All of her energy was now focused on the desire to learn who Starlight Glimmer was, and why she had supposedly intruded on her and Spike's home. It didn't help that there was clearly more to Spike's story than he was able to tell before the mayor's magic took effect. And while it was certainly possible for her to simply trigger the reaction again and hope he would give her the correct information, she didn't know enough about this spell to know if it was safe or not. For all she knew, the actual memory correction itself could have been painful, and the last thing she wanted was to hurt Spike for the sake of her own curiosity. Oi! What's all the racket down here about, Knox? All of Knox's screaming had finally drawn the attention of the night guard, prompting him to storm down to the end of the hall to see what was going on. Funnily enough, it was the very same stallion Twilight had teleported earlier. Small world.
What racket?
Knox was the first to ask, just as confused as the guard was.
I was merely discussing... something... with Twilight?
Holding a hoof up to his head, he looked at the floor with a perplexed look of dread.
I think my previous night of drinking has caught up to me again. I should get some rest.
He said nothing else as he returned to his bed, crawling under the covers and falling asleep. The guard addressed him for a couple more minutes, to no avail, before growing too irritated and in a huff, walking back to his post. But not before giving Twilight a stern look. Not that Twilight really gave a damn. Her mind was ablaze with the answer she had been given and the new question she was now asking, pooling in her brain like a toxic swamp of anxiety and rage. But there wasn't anything she could do from within this cage, and as much as she wanted answers, she had to stay put for now, for Spike's sake. Besides, getting some rest would probably be a good thing at this point. Twilight spent a while easing Spike out of his agitated state, before sending him back to bed, the time doing wonders to help her calm her own anxiety. Before long, Spike was back to sleep, with his caretaker not too far behind him. After the day Twilight had been through, even the cold concrete floor was a welcoming cushion for her to rest soundly upon.